Welcome to meeting number 100 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Indigenous and Northern Affairs. We recognize that we meet on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format. Welcome, Ms. Ashton, and everybody else is here in person. I think, Ms. Ashton, you've done lots of Zoom ones. You know how to run everything. So I'll just get right into, we have, a bit of a housekeeping thing. The Leader of the Government in the House announced that Thursday, March 21st, 2024 will be the final allotted day in the current period, which means that all votes in the Supplementary Estimate C 2023-24 will be deemed reported to the House since the ordinary hour of daily adjournment on Monday, March 18th, 2024. Everybody got that? As such, any committee studying the Supplementary Estimate C after Monday, March 18th, 2024 will not do so under order of reference from the House. This study and subsequent report, if desired by the committee, will have to be done under Standing Order 108. Please note that in this case, the committee will not adopt the votes. And pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, February 26, 2024, the committee is meeting to discuss the subject matter of the Supplementary Estimate C. So we won't be reporting back to the House. It's subject matter only. That's what that tells us. With that, I'd like to welcome our witnesses to the table today, and starting with the Honourable Patty Hajdu, Minister of Indigenous Services. Welcome, Minister. From the department, we have many officials. Thank you for being here. Starting with Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister, Candace Saint-Aubin, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, and I apologize now if I mess up anybody's names. You can correct me when we get into questions. Paula Hayden-Jokiel, is that close? Okay. Assistant Deputy Minister, Natalie Nepton, Acting Assistant Deputy Minister, Education and Social Development Programs and Partnerships. Nelson Barbosa, Director General, Regional Operations. Katrina Peddle, Director General, Act Respecting First Nations, Inuit and Métis Children, Youth and Families Branch. Jessica Sultan, Director General, Economic and Business Opportunities, Lands and Economic Development. Jonathan Ellen, Acting Director General, Education, Social Development Programs and Partnerships. And Philippe Thompson, Chief Finances, Results and Delivery Officer. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to use a little card system here. So yellow means 30 seconds left, red, time's up. Don't stop mid-sentence, but wind up your thoughts, and we'll continue on with the next speaker. So with that, Minister, I assume you're going to do the opening statement for 5 minutes. And when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the officials for taking their time away from their busy jobs to be with me today. But I thought it would be good to have the team with us so that they can answer to the level of detail that I think this committee deserves. It's truly a joy to be with you here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people pour vous parler des progrès que le gouvernement libéral fait.
To tell you about the progress the Liberal government is making on reconciliation, we have to go back 8 years. When we were elected in 2015, the Conservatives were far from friendly to Indigenous partners. And in the last 8 years, under Justin Trudeau, reconciliation has become a priority.
That begins with water. As you know, the previous Conservative government ignored the needs of First Nations communities for clean water, and as a result, when we were elected, 105 long-term boil water advisories were in place. But today, after working with communities and increasing investments by over 150%, the vast majority of First Nations have clean drinking water they can trust. We still have 4% of communities that live with a long-term advisory, but there is a plan underway for each of them, and Canadians can follow along online in terms of where communities are at. We do need, as we know, to be focused on sustained, equitable support for water systems, because if we don't have ongoing investments in not just the equipment that serves First Nations people, but for the training and for the maintenance, all of that progress could vanish. Reconciliation is not a destination, it's a journey, and it requires a long-term commitment, regardless of which party is leading the country. So that's why Bill C-61, the First Nations Clean Water Act, is so important to partners. This piece of legislation was developed through historic participation with First Nations, and it restores the rights of First Nations to manage their own water systems. And for the very first time in our history, it holds the federal government accountable for equitable funding for water systems in First Nations. In fact, it installs an ability for First Nations to work with the Government of Canada to determine levels of funding that will ensure that clean water for generations to come. The AFN is calling on Parliament to pass that bill because, as Chief Erica Baudouin of Coassus First Nation said, Indigenous people, Indigenous children deserve to be conceived, born, and die with clean water access. And so it was distressing for partners who were in the audience that day to see, on the first day of debate, a Conservative member of Parliament choose instead to repeat very tired stereotypes, ignoring the discriminatory funding as a cause of that lack of water. And many First Nations people were deeply hurt by those comments, and many are still waiting for a sincere apology. Les peuples autochtones créent.
Indigenous peoples are also creating change in housing. I was recently celebrating the construction of new homes in Liard First Nation with Chief Charlie. He told me housing is intrinsic to health and well-being. You know this as well as I do. There is still a lot of work to be done.
The Auditor General yesterday shows that decades of colonialism and underinvestment have had significant and deep impacts on Indigenous communities. And it's why our Liberal government has increased spending on housing for Indigenous people by over 1,100%. For the first time in recent history, the proportion of people living in overcrowded homes has stabilized and is starting to decrease. It's a huge contrast to the approach of the previous government, which resulted in only 99 houses built in First Nations for the cost of $300 million. In contrast, since 2015, over 34,000 homes have been built or renovated in First Nations, with 22,000 already completed. And this is fundamental because, as all of you know, better housing means more people can reach their true potential. Mr. Chair, I've said it already, reconciliation is not a destination, it's a relationship, and respect is at the foundation of every good relationship. We must work directly with communities to address their needs, tackle the systemic issues that they are facing, and transfer the service delivery back under their control. Now, I know this is an uncomfortable approach for those that are more comfortable with the paternalism of the past, but paternalism has not resulted in healthy communities and people. This government is working to live up to the promise of a Canada where everyone can truly reach their full potential, and we can only do that in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Miigwech, Kuyanemek, merci, Marty, thank you.
Timing, thank you, Minister. We're going to go into our first round of questions, which are 6 minutes each, and first up I have Mr. Schmale. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for appearing today. Minister, I met with the Nisi Chawe Ashik Cree Nation today, and they had mentioned that in 2019 they were approved tender-ready, shovel-ready for their medical center in 2019, but yet they have yet to receive funding. I'm short on time, but in 30 seconds or left, can you explain why?
Well, as you would know, MP Schmale, medical centers and health provision is a joint responsibility of the province and the federal government, along with the First Nations, who often deliver care through nursing centers. I can tell you that negotiations of that kind are underway on a regular basis for many different infrastructure projects, but I would have to turn to officials about that specific project.
Very quickly, please.
Thank you for that. I think, Minister, you've covered the big points, and thank you for the question. There are ongoing conversations. As you can imagine, there are several requests in the system right now, and we look forward to continuing to work with communities to ensure that the funding flows quickly and that there can be actual shovels in the ground to ensure that it's ready.
Thank you very much. Minister, as you know, 133 chiefs in Ontario have come together to come out against the carbon tax. In fact, they're taking your government to court because they do not feel that they were heard. Some of these chiefs are in your riding. Do you feel that it's time to axe the tax?
Well, I think I've responded to this question before, certainly in the media, and in fact, that's a misrepresentation of what the letter says. In fact, what the letter says is that the chiefs would like a larger percentage of the carbon, they would like a larger rebate from the carbon tax. And in fact, should that not be possible, obviously they did. They wanted they wanted a positive answer from the government. And I'm really pleased to say that the finance minister just a couple days ago has signed off on doubling the rebate for Indigenous communities from 1% to 2%. So that is going to be good news for the Chiefs of Ontario. And I'm really looking forward to being able to work with the Chiefs of Ontario on their priorities, which is making, of course, life affordable for First Nations people and keeping a healthy environment for the next generations, in fact, the next 7 generations to come.
Right. So the carbon tax on the cost of fuel, on the cost of food, on the cost of transport, on the cost of the actual retailer selling it, that all has implications across the chain. I seem to miss how they are actually getting a better quality of life if throughout that food chain the costs are going up each and every way. And as the parliamentary budget officer has showed, the rebates are not helping non-Indigenous Canadians. Indigenous peoples are now dealing with the fact that the rebate is next to nothing. I still don't understand how life is becoming more affordable.
I will tell you that the conversations I have with First Nations people really focus on 2 things. One, to end the ongoing colonialism that Indigenous people have faced at the hands of many governments, but in particular under the previous government, which not only didn't invest in First Nations communities, but refused to meet with First Nations leaders to talk about these very issues. The second most common thing I talk about with First Nations people is actually the climate. And in Alberta, the Chiefs...
Did you take a meeting with the Ontario Chiefs when they asked for a meeting regarding the carbon tax?
I have met with the Ontario Chiefs multiple times, and in fact, Glenn Hare and I are colleagues and acquaintances, and I would say that I will meet with any First Nations chief that wishes to do so and do so on a regular basis. But let me finish my thought, Mr. Chair. In Alberta, when I met with Albertan chiefs just recently, a few months back, their biggest concern was what was going to happen with the drying up aquifers and the lack of water that, in fact, the entire province is dealing with right now. And it's a deep concern because, in fact, this means that not only is it going to prevent access to drinking water, but all of the other ways that water is used by First Nations communities for economic development is hampered by the ongoing onslaught of climate change. And that is the second most frequent thing I talk about.
So you mentioned water advisories. So Niskanta, in my friend Eric Melillo's riding, has been on a boil advisory for 29 years. Can you please update us on the status of that situation?
Absolutely.
In 30 seconds or less.
Absolutely. And I hope Mr. Melillo has visited Niskantaga. I have, and I have a deep relationship with Chief Munias. As a matter of fact, he was in Ottawa just a few weeks ago and is quite happy with the progress that we're making. There are a number of conditions that he thinks needs to be in place, and we agree, our engineers agree, before he is comfortable with proceeding with a lift. But he feels very confident that for the very first time, he is working with a government that is listening to Nishkandaga's needs. And I invite you to visit Nishkandaga and meet Chief Munias. They are an incredible community doing incredible things.
I can tell you Mr. Melillo is doing a great job for that riding, bringing their concerns to Ottawa.
I hope that he's visited Nishkandaga. I certainly would love to bring you anytime.
Well, Minister, this is my time, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about housing now because you brought it up in the Auditor General's report. The Auditor General is showing that there doesn't seem to be any improvement in housing since 2015. In fact, only one of the ISC regional offices collected information about the mold strategy, which was created in 2008. Can you explain why?
Well, I can certainly tell you that for the very first time in the history of this country, we're seeing a stopping of the loss of housing. And that's important because, in fact, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, year after year, we were seeing a decline in the availability of housing for First Nations. Do we have more to do? We absolutely, without a doubt, have more to do. We have a massive investments ahead of us, and it will take all of us, in fact, not voting against things like investments in affordable housing on First Nation that I have seen and noted that your members vote against time and time again. That, quite frankly, is shameful.
Actually,
what we need
all
parties to do,
confidence in this
what we
government.
all need,
We're
what we need all
Thank
parties to do is to pull together and insist that we spend more money to close that gap. And I look forward to doing that work with you.
Well, more money is being spent,
out of time in this round.
The conditions not getting any better.
I'm going to cut off this round of questions and go to the next. I have Mr. Pawlowski first up for the.
Welcome to committee, Patty. I wanted to ask you for an update on where the $2 billion that our government had committed for Indigenous health will be going. I think the last time we spoke, I think you quite rightly said you were waiting to hear from Indigenous communities themselves as to where they'd like to see the money go. But I wanted to, and I'm going to give you a prolonged period to respond to this question, but let me just talk about a few of the things I've heard from the Indigenous community within my riding. Certainly one of the suggestions from Fort William First Nations was about the possibility of funding their chronic care home. As I think you know, both Chief Solomon and Chief Collins have really made that a priority in healthcare. The second thing I wanted to ask about was funding for land-based treatment, both for addictions and mental health, which again, several different Indigenous communities in my riding have asked me about. They're looking for funding for that. Lastly, about any funding to go for Indigenous people who live off reserve. As you know, a lot of Indigenous people kind of spend part of their time on reserve, part of their time off reserve. Thunder Bay has a large Indigenous population. So I wonder if you could answer the question overall, but also in response to those three specific areas. And you're welcome to ask any of your many able
Thank you.
there.
And I will for some of the details. But let me just start with the $2 billion Health Equity Fund, which I think I'm really glad you raised this. This is an innovative new support for First Nations who have Indigenous people, quite frankly, across the country who have oftentimes faced extreme racism in healthcare systems and provincial and territorial systems. In fact, it arises from the situation, the sad case of Joyce Echequan, as you know, who died filming her own abuse and led to the Indigenous Healthcare Summit held during the pandemic, where we heard from health experts, Indigenous health experts, and individuals about what we could do together to better to better help with the experiences that Indigenous people face in healthcare every day. And it's ongoing, by the way. I don't want to leave the impression that Joyce was an isolated incident. These kinds of things are happening every day in every healthcare system, either intentionally or oftentimes through systemic design that just doesn't meet people's needs. And quite frankly, these systems have been designed in ways that exclude the realities of Indigenous people. So the Prime Minister committed to this $2 billion Health Equity Fund to help Indigenous groups and leaders, communities who have innovative ideas about how to bridge that gap between healthcare provision in provinces and territories with the expectations that they have in terms of better health outcomes. And it complements the work that Minister Holland's doing on renewing those healthcare transfers, which, by the way, I've been at all of those meetings with provinces and territories with Indigenous partners to talk about our expectation that we eliminate racism in healthcare. So I will turn to Candace to talk about how that money is getting divided and some of the innovation that you're hearing about how people will use that money.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. The Indigenous Health Equity Fund will be flowing out to communities regionally April 1st. We are currently engaging in how that will be implemented. As you are aware, this will provide a 10-year funding, sustainability, and maximizing innovation. So that could be, and certainly we're encouraging communities to look at what their needs are and invest in that. And by the 10 years, they're able to move that money around to target different initiatives, including land-based treatment, as you were talking about, certainly looking at how best to address substance and opioid realities that we're seeing in community, but also working with provinces to try and leverage the funding that's currently going into the health transfers and to maximize those. It could be much more clinical care, but also really around virtual hubs, supporting e-health, in particular mental health e-health, to maybe alleviate some of the medical transportation that's required in more northern remote communities. We do see a lot of innovation happening at the community level that they're driving. This is allowing them greater flexibility to plan those and maybe amplify those.
Are you considering funding chronic care homes? Again, that's big in Fort William First Nations, and I think also Rainy River First Nations.
So what I would say, and that's a valuable question, what I would say is it's really the beauty of the Indigenous Health Equity Fund is that it is up to communities to determine where that need is. We are not prescriptive. We allow broad flexibilities because we do already provide a level of funding.
Having said that, there's a lot of Indigenous communities, a lot of competing interests, how are you going to kind of determine who you're going to fund? And when will that funding stream become open for communities to apply?
So to be clear, it's not an application base, and I was really personally insistent on that as the minister, because application base usually preferences communities that have good grant writers' ability to apply for grants. And in fact, the Auditor General spoke about this in housing access, housing money access. And so we're trying to think through how we ensure that people get the money regardless of their capacity to write a grant, quite frankly. And so this money will be sent out April 1st to, as my colleague said, to regional governance, to local governance, to people that are actually delivering healthcare or working with partners to deliver healthcare. And after that is sent out, we can certainly send a list. I would just lastly say, Marcus, that it is really designed in a flexible way so that First Nations can use it in whatever way they want. But I have seen some really interesting things that are about bridging the gap between Western medicine and Indigenous medicine. So in Manitoba, for example, we've funded in previous types of program funding health ombudsmen, so that actually if an Indigenous person is not getting the care they need in downtown Winnipeg, this might interest you, MP Carr, because it's in your neck of the woods, the health ombudsman through the Manitoba Chiefs Council is able to actually take those concerns from the individual and then act as an advocate for that individual within the Manitoba healthcare system. Something I'm hoping that we'll be able to work more closely with that province with the election of its first First Nations premier.
Great, thank you. We're out of time on that one. I should have mentioned, we're a pretty collegial group here, and the members try to get as many questions out as they can. And so when anybody has the floor, I'd say get your question out. And we also want to make sure that the minister and her team have time to respond. And so we'll just have a nice discussion as we go through this afternoon. And I direct that to all members just so we have a good conversation today. With that, Monsieur Lemire, the floor is yours now for your 6 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, merci.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to thank the Minister for being here today. One of the aspects that is not mentioned in the supplementary estimates is housing, and housing is essential. In Quebec only, we have $8 billion in need, $44 billion in Canada. So I want to approach this from a more positive point of view and recognize the contribution of First Nations and Inuits in Quebec and the work that they have done. Quebec is the province that has been doing the best when it comes to creating and prioritizing capacity in First Nations. And Quebec is making more progress than other provinces. And the contribution of Indigenous financial institutions is also important. There's SOCA of the Wendake, for instance, and it's essential to developing this capacity. They filed their requests for longer-term financing in pre-budget consultations on 31st of March 2024, so tomorrow morning. They're asking actually for $150 million for mortgages. And the federal government doesn't seem to be really providing an answer to Indigenous communities when it comes to long-term predictability. And there is an initiative, which is social innovation initiative by Indigenous communities. So are you going to engage with the Minister of Finance to follow and answer and respond to these financial requests by Indigenous communities?
Pardon?
Yes, and I am working with the Minister of Finance every day on this file.
Minister Heyman, Chief Heyman, Lance Heyman, recently about, for example, you raised mortgages and how we can actually finance mortgages in First Nations. I think the Minister of Finance is very interested in that idea. And so we'll continue to pursue those innovative ideas that are coming from Indigenous people. That's what's so great about this. I think, the days of Canada telling Indigenous people how to solve these problems is over. We've obviously not been able to be dictating to First Nations exactly what the solution are. So we're very excited when Chief Heyman and others come forward to talk about different ownership structures that could work within the context of a First Nation. Merci.
Miigwech, effectivement, merci de souligner la contribution de...
Thank you for underlining the contributions of chiefs especially from my riding in the Temiskaming region as well. But of course, we have to have confidence in First Nations in a matter like this, and especially in Quebec, they want to take ownership of housing as a general issue. And there's the INAN initiative to this end, and they're trying to build a common spaces, and they underline the individual responsibility in housing and sustainable use and development of resources and lands. So I appreciate your answer, but of course, we will have to wait and see the result in the context that we have currently. So the Auditor General was critical of the passive posture of the department. What would you like to respond, Minister? And are you going to come up with an in-depth reform of the practices and policies of Indigenous Services Canada in light of the results that we have seen so far, which have been criticized?
Well, I mean, two things. One, I would say that, passive response of the department, I'm not sure that's accurate from what I see every single day. I would say that the department works with the fiscal resources it has, and in fact is very ambitious about getting any extra dollars out the door. And oftentimes when dollars are about to lapse for housing because projects haven't been built or they're not underway, the department will come to me and ask to reprioritize that money to communities that can use that money. So we're very, very cautious and careful to not let any money lapse, because we need that money because there is such a great need across the country. So I would say that I haven't seen that in the space of housing at all. What I can say, though, is that, and I think you're talking about this part of the Auditor General's report, where she talks about vulnerable communities and how far away sometimes vulnerable communities are from actually being able to access housing. And in that case, we have a number of different First Nations-led agencies that will help communities to gain the governance skills and fiscal skills that they need to be able to move forward more quickly. And I know the department works with those communities as well, can actually provide a lot of support to those communities and certainly connect them to these Indigenous-led institutions so that they have a greater capacity. And I will just say, before anyone says that this is in any way undermining the skills and talent of Indigenous peoples, communities are often under a huge degree of stress. Most chiefs I know are not just elected officials like us. They are also responding to middle of the night.
I'm going to have to interrupt just briefly. I see that there are bells again.
Okay.
And so I'm going to check with the committee to see if we have unanimous consent to proceed through bells. If we are people going to want to go upstairs to vote, or do you want to vote remotely? And so I know if I give 10 minutes. Okay, keep going, and we'll make sure that we let people know when the vote happens.
If I can just finish that one thought, Mr. Chair, because I think it's important to understand that communities that have a deep a state of distress, those chiefs are some of the hardest working people I've ever met. They are literally putting out fires. They are answering calls at all times of day and night. And so our job, I think, as a government and as a country is to support those chiefs as they begin to stabilize their communities. And that's how we work with those fragile communities, to ensure that they have the supports they need.
Great, thank you.
Merci. Je fais juste ajouter.
Thank you. I'm just going to add that I will also table a motion before the committee so that we can look into many aspects underlined by the Auditor General in connection with First Nations. It would be very important for the committee to hear from Ms. Hogan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go now to Ms. Ashton. So when you're ready, Ms. Ashton, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. Madam Minister, over the next 2 years, Indigenous Services Canada plans on sunsetting funding streams and cutting spending on programs like Jordan's Principle, dealing with the harmful legacy, programs that deal with the harmful legacy of residential schools and support for mental health. Indigenous Services Canada plans on $500 million worth of cuts in the next 4 years. While the department has reassured Indigenous communities, leaders, that these massive cuts won't affect services, we have never seen in our history, and certainly not in recent history, a proposed cut and the sunsetting of this much money. We know that the elimination of these critical programs will be devastating for communities that already rely on them and that need all the support they can get. At a time where the need is so great, why is your government choosing to cut rather than invest in First Nations?
Well, thank you very much. And as I've said publicly and repeatedly, this government is not cutting services and not cutting any service, not reducing any spending initiatives that would impact service delivery to Indigenous communities. The reductions that you see in our departmental plan are related to internal operating efficiencies, some program funding that's not being utilized, specifically the new fiscal agreement money that has not had the uptake that we had hoped. Certainly can go back to it if we see a greater uptake. But the premise of your question is incorrect. In fact, the programs that you reference are ongoing. We have a legal commitment to Jordan's Principle, for example, and this government has every intent to uphold it.
Okay, I think we'll have to agree to disagree because the sunsetting of this much, these kinds of investments are not seen as good news for anybody on the ground. Let's move to housing. If you ask me to describe one of the government's biggest failures when it comes to Indigenous communities, it would be on housing, and I think the Auditor General's report certainly proves that. We heard yesterday that since the Liberals took over in 2015, there's been, quote, no meaningful improvement, unquote, in housing on reserve, and that it's highly unlikely that your government will meet its 2030 targets. I see the housing crisis in community after community here in northern Manitoba. First Nations like Shamattawa, Poplar River, Garden Hill, Pucketawagan are clear that they face a housing crisis. We heard a number of shocking statements in the report from the Auditor General yesterday. She highlighted that since 2015, ISC has spent less than 7% of what's needed to end the housing gap on reserve. How do you justify this lack of action of First Nations living in overcrowded, moldy, and inhumane conditions?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And I'll first say that no one should justify anyone living in those conditions. And as I said in my media response yesterday at the press conference, I seriously hope that Canadians have the same fervor for housing as they have had for water, because I certainly think that every government, this one and into the future, needs to remain focused on alleviating the ongoing gap for Indigenous peoples, including in housing. And I will say that, as I said in my response to one of your colleagues here in the room, that housing and infrastructure deficits are one of the most frequent things that I speak about with First Nations chief across the country. So that is why this government remains committed to closing that gap. You're right, the 2030 gap is ambitious. And so we know that the federal government has to work with partners to be able to close that gap. We are certainly making the investments, an 1,100% increase in the funding of housing since 2015. 34,000 homes is nothing to sneeze at, especially when you compare it to the previous government's abysmal performance in this space. But I will say that those investments must be sustained. And in order to build from where we are now, which is now we are at a space where we're not seeing increased overcrowding. We're starting to see communities level off. We're starting to have positive feedback from First Nations that are controlling and designing their own solutions to ongoing housing challenges, that we have to continue to accelerate that gain. And we do that by the continued investment.
Climate change, as you know, is hitting Indigenous communities hardest. In our region, this is evident in many ways. One of the most evident is the way in which ice roads have become increasingly unreliable. For isolated First Nations, this is a matter of life and death. First Nations in our region are clear. There needs to be a revival of the East Side Road Authority initiative, and federal investment is required. Is your government prepared to support the call for all-weather road infrastructure, including an airport for Wasagamak First Nation, investment in the road being proposed between St. Teresa Point and Barons River, and a northern route to service First Nations like Oxford House, Garden Hill, and First Nations in between?
Well, thank you very much. And in terms of the Wasagamak Airport, you would know, MP Ashton, that I have been working with my colleague, the Minister of Transport, on this and have shared with him your advocacy. And I want to thank you for that, because you're absolutely right. We have been extremely worried about the state of ice roads this year. And it has a massive impact, as you've pointed out, on everything, including the cost of building housing. So infrastructure development in remote communities depends on materials and equipment being shipped up during ice road season, and those seasons are getting shorter and shorter. So we will continue to do whatever it takes to make sure that essential resources are shipped, but I think this calls for a larger conversation amongst multiple departments and provincial and territorial partners, because I think we are facing down a very immediate crisis related to climate change. And I'm glad you started with climate change, and it is a pleasure to work with a party that acknowledges that climate change is real and is having extraordinary fiscal impacts on First Nations that include the inability to be able to get goods and equipment up to communities in a cost-effective way.
Okay, we're out of time in that round.
Yep.
So
Okay.
we'll go to our slightly shorter rounds now. I do want to check with everybody just to confirm we're 21 minutes away, just under 22 minutes away from the vote. Are people comfortable or okay to vote remotely? And so we'll go right up until when the vote starts. I'll then suspend the meeting for a couple of minutes while people vote, and then we'll resume as quickly as possible. Ms. Ashton, are you okay with that as well? Yeah, okay, perfect, thank you. So the next round, first questions for 5 minutes, and Mr. Janis, the floor is yours.
Chair, Minister Haidu, Canadians would expect that the Indigenous procurement system be designed to benefit Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities, not a small number of well-connected NDP Liberal government insiders. Dalian is a two-person company. They don't do actual work. They just get government contracts and subcontract to others. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government sent to Dalian for a Arrive scam?
I think I'll just blow by all the stupid slogans and answer the question. Well, I'll tell you that the Indigenous Business Directory is...
I'd love for you to answer the question. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government gave to Dalian for a Arrive scam?
So I think I'll just blow by the stupid slogans and begin by answering the question in a sincere way, which is what I would hope we would all do around this table, because these are serious issues and sincere concerns. So let me just back up and say Indigenous Services Canada does manage...
Please don't back up. Please just answer the question.
I would love to do that. Are you ready to listen?
Go for it.
All right, great.
How many Indigenous people benefited? Just the number would be fine, actually.
So the Indigenous Business Directory is a directory that Indigenous Services Canada maintains to provide to other departments of Canada a list of businesses that have been verified as either...
Sorry, Minister, this is a two-person company. They don't do any actual work. They're listed on the Indigenous Businesses Directory. They receive contracts and subcontract. That's all they do. They get government contracts. They subcontract the work to others. Okay. How many Indigenous people benefited from the $7.9 million that your government gave to Dalian? I'm not looking for a history of the program.
Point of order,
I'm just looking
Mr.
for
Chair.
a number.
Well, I think that...
Sorry, just 1 second. I'll stop the clock. Mr. Batiste, what's your point of order?
The member has asked, it's repetition. She's trying to answer the question. The minister keeps getting
Jamie, respectfully learn the rules,
order.
okay? It's not a point of order, and it's not a repetition issue. I'm repeating the question because I want the answer.
You're coming in from another committee, but
she's a minister, you're not. Let her answer.
We are into debate. We are into debate, but I will say that, as I noted, we ask the minister questions, we allow the minister to answer.
Just the number. That's all I need.
So I'll turn the floor to the minister and to continue with your response, please.
So to understand the Indigenous Business Directory, you have to understand what it's for. And the Indigenous Business Directory is to provide assurances to other departments, including Procurement Canada, that the people on that list are Indigenous. And so that is the sole purpose of the list. It's about indigeneity.
Okay. Minister, what Mr. Yeo told the Public Accounts Committee yesterday is that the purpose of the program is not to benefit Indigenous communities, but only to benefit the particular individuals who receive the contracts. What you've just said effectively confirms that. It sounds like you have no information about whether Indigenous peoples or communities actually benefited beyond the 2 people who got $7.9 million for no work. Of all Dalian's contracts totaling at least $91 million under your government, did all of those $91 million worth of contracts benefit from the Indigenous procurement set aside? And what percentage of the subcontractors were Indigenous?
I would like, I'm actually kind of annoyed by this question because it implies that if an Italian person owned a company, then only Italian people should benefit from that company's business. And in that is an implicit, I would say, stereotype. Indigenous business owners are just like non-Indigenous business owners. And some Indigenous business owners have many Indigenous employees. In fact, many businesses do.
Minister, I'm going to spare you the false indignation here. Okay?
Your question is implicitly
no, Mr. Chair, I'm going to jump in accordance with the rules.
Discriminatory.
Yeah, of course. Here we go, Minister. Your government faces intense heat over this corruption scandal, and your response, your only response, is not to answer the question, but to accuse other people of racism. This is so typical of your government. Now, I'm going to finish, Minister. Here are the facts, right? Dalian is a 2-person company. They don't have employees. There's just 2 of them, right? So does it seem to you a problem that this company can get close to $100 million worth of contracts from your government? They don't do any work. They subcontract. That there's no tracking of whether Indigenous people actually benefit. There's no tracking about whether other Indigenous businesses receive subcontracts. And that simply by being the middleman, they're able to claim this massive set-aside when there is no tracking of actual benefits to Indigenous communities across the country. Don't you think that's a problem?
What I would say is that whatever has happened, contractors should be held accountable, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or not. The rules don't change.
But do you think this is an abuse of the Indigenous procurement program? Do you think this is an abuse of the intention of the program?
Yeah, I would ask, there's only 10 seconds left.
I would say if people are on the list who are not Indigenous, it is an abuse, and that is why Dalian.
So you're fine with what happened with Dalian?
Okay, we're out of time on this one. I'm going to have to move to the next person. Next up, I have Mr. Carr for his 5 minutes.
Hi, Minister. As you know, I spent a lot of time in my career as an educator.
You did.
And during my time as an educator, I had the privilege of working with a lot of Indigenous students and their families in the northwest part of the city of Winnipeg, where I come from. One of the things I noticed, in addition to so many of the challenges that Indigenous families face still as a result of intergenerational trauma born from residential schools, colonial policies, all of the things that we're well aware of, is that within the education system itself, the public education system specifically, because of a shortage of educational opportunities, we often see students having to leave their communities to come down to the big cities, like Winnipeg, for example, where they're vulnerable. There's a bit of culture shock, there's susceptibility to gang influence, they're away from their families, and there are all sorts of different challenges that are posed as a result of this. A lot of it has to do with provincial government jurisdiction over education, of course, but I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about the role that the federal government has to play in supporting Indigenous education across the country, and if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the guidance or suggestions that you might be hearing from Indigenous leaders, specifically in relation to the education system in our country. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for a sincere question. And I would say that, this is an area where I think our government has a lot to talk about, quite frankly. Prior to the election of the Liberals, the federal Liberals, we saw discriminatory funding levels for Indigenous education across this country, board after board. And what I mean by that is that the dollars spent per child, for lack of a better metric, was far lower for Indigenous communities than in a similar provincial system. And so we fixed that. We fixed that because we knew that education of young people is one of the best things that we can do to invest in our country and in the success of each person. And so that has been a hallmark, I think, of our government, is to ensure that Indigenous education systems across this country have equitable funding as to what you could expect in provincial systems. We've, in fact, increased education by 80% since 2016. So again, a big number, and it just defines how big the gap was prior to our election in 2015. Now, we're not just spending money through improving education systems, but we are also building and renovating schools with First Nations people, because many of the schools that children have been learning in have been, quite frankly, abysmal and left to rot by successive governments who really didn't make those kinds of investments. In the schools that I have an opportunity to visit, you can see bright, happy children and really content teachers in those facilities, teaching in ways that are going to help those young people reach their education potential. The final thing I'll say is that we have been pursuing what we're calling and what is called regional education agreements, which restores Indigenous sovereignty over how education is delivered in communities. In fact, in Quebec, this was an amazing opportunity for me to be at the signing of one of these regional education authorities, and the young people, the educators, the students, the families, just celebrating the ability to be able to design their own curriculum, to be able to incorporate language and culture and tradition and healing into the curriculum that will allow for their children to have a fair shot at success, just like every other child in that province. And we've since then signed, I think, four regional education agreements, and we have a number underway. So we are transforming education in this country together with First Nations leading the way.
Thanks, Minister. I think I agree with you in terms of the quality of the relationship that I think the federal government is enjoying with the new provincial government in Manitoba. There's an alignment of values and an alignment of beliefs, I think, specifically to achieving more progress on the road to truth and reconciliation. I look forward to a continued conversation with you about some of the ways that we can work together with the province to address things like teacher shortages that we're seeing on reserve communities in the north, as well as addressing, you spoke about curriculum, and I'm very pleased to hear you substantiate some of the progress I know is being made. But there's all sorts of things, I think, that we have to look at in terms of colonial practices that still exist for students in the public education system. Again, I understand it's a provincial jurisdiction, but in many instances, these are kids coming from First Nation reserves ending up in the provincial system. So the partnership between the federal government and provincial government and local school boards is really critical to ensuring we offer them the support they need. So I thank you for your ongoing work in this regard and look forward to our continued work together.
Thank you, and we're out of time. We'll now go to Monsieur Lemire for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, in August 2023, your department stated that there wouldn't be a reduction in the funds available in terms of services for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. But when we look at the 24-25 departmental plan, it is clear that the service delivery will be significantly impacted by budgetary cuts. The department envisages that the expenditure for Indigenous well-being and self-determination, so all services, will be around $2 billion. $20.7 billion for 2024-2025, so there will be a reduction in this number. And the reduction of expenditure for internal services will go from $282 million to $265 million in 24-25, which is roughly a 6% reduction. Again, you signed on these numbers, and there's also the objective of school infrastructure by 2030, but there will be $145 million of expenditure, but it's nowhere near sufficient, and the expenditure is deemed to be a lot higher than that. In Quebec, there's $3.9 million set aside for major renovation. Would you be able to justify these cuts in services, in essential services to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations communities, and What justifies that we are at this point, whereas you were saying that there wouldn't be any cuts? Thank you.
Well, I've been clear that there won't be any reductions to service levels and that the Refocusing Government Spending Initiative will not impact service delivery to Indigenous communities. And so the reductions that you see in the departmental plan are related to internal operating efficiencies. And any program funding that's not being utilized, for instance, funding that's no longer required from the fiscal framework. And I did mention the new fiscal relationship grant that, based on current and projected uptake, a portion of that funding won't be required from the fiscal framework at this point in time, amounting to $256.7 million over 5 years and $89.9 million in ongoing funding. But even with these cost savings, the new fiscal relationship grant escalator would remain fully funded. There will be no impact on the level of the escalator funding for current and future recipients. And so I think obviously...
Sorry, I'm just going to say, wrap it up. We're out of time.
So I'll just say again that this department is focused on making sure that they provide excellent service in an efficient way, and looking for efficiencies is an important part of the work that they do.
Okay. Thank you. And now, Ms. Ashton, we'll go to you for your 2.5 minutes.
Thank you. I'd like to get to the issue of nursing shortages. We know that out of the 223 nurses ISC says it needs, 43 positions are unfilled. On top of that, more than half of the nurse positions that are filled by contract agencies who are only providing emergency care rather than primary care that First Nations deserve and desperately need. It's gotten so bad that communities are posting notices about the lack of nurses in their communities. When I was in Wasaga First Nation on February 20th, in front of the store, there was a notice that said the nursing station is closed due to nurse shortages starting the week of January 29th until further notice. Chicamac Cree Nation recently declared a state of emergency. Even though they're supposed to have 13 nurses, they had far fewer than that, 4. And when they declared the state of emergency, they were committed another 4, 8, still short of the 13 that they deserve, given how large the First Nation is, how large the community is. We know that nurses have been clear about the stress, the burnout that they face, and we know that communities are not getting the health care they deserve. In fact, I joined with First Nations leaders who've been very clear that this has had a devastating impact, including in cases of premature death. This is an urgent situation. What is ISC doing to help First Nations like Pimicikamak, like Wasagamack, like Little Grand Rapids, who have declared their states of emergencies or put forward these urgent notices? What is ISC doing to work with them to lift these states of emergencies and ensure that there are enough nurses to serve First Nations?
Well, thank you, MP Ashton. And I would say that this is a crisis that's affecting Canada. In fact, nursing shortages are profound in pretty much every community across this country, and they're even more profound in remote communities. And that's why Indigenous Services Canada has been so focused on what we can do to recruit and retain and train nurses to choose to work in the North, to stay in the North, and to build that internal capacity of communities by ensuring that more Indigenous people choose healthcare as a pathway for their own personal careers. We have used things like retention strategies, increased investments to ensure competitive pay, signing bonuses. Pretty much, we have thrown everything at the wall to get nurses in place. And I will tell you, there's nothing more stressful for a community, as you've pointed out, but certainly for my officials, because I see those messages that come through at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, 5 in the morning, where officials are working with communities just like the one you've mentioned, like many communities across northern and remote communities, to address these nursing shortages. So we're going to keep at it, obviously, and obviously whatever it requires, we will be there to try to ensure that communities have the complement of nurses they need, but furthermore, that we are investing in those kinds of innovations that communities are talking about that can have greater capacity now with the $2 billion health equity fund, with the health transfers, partners, with willing provinces and territories who are interested in partnering with First Nations
Minister,
to get the health equity care that they need.
We're out of time on this one.
Okay.
And so now, colleagues, there's just over 3 minutes until the vote. We could either suspend now or start Mr. Malillo's 5 minutes. If you're okay being interrupted, I'll suspend the meeting while we vote, and then once everybody's confirmed that they voted, we'll resume and finish off this time that we have with the minister. We started at 5:11, so we'll try to wrap up as close to 6:11, less the suspension, as we can. So, Mr. Malillo, would you like to start? Okay. So when you're ready, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. I'd like to pick up on the Auditor General report that was mentioned earlier around housing. Of course, it notes that your government has supposedly committed to closing the gap on housing in First Nations by 2030, but the Auditor General has found that the department has no plan to do that, and that the number of homes that is needed to be replaced due to deteriorating conditions is actually increased since your government came into office. The report has also found that many of the nations most in need are not getting proper funding and, in fact, getting less funding. So how would you explain that disparity?
Thank you, and thank you for asking this question, because I think the more that we talk about Indigenous access to housing and First Nations, the better off this country will be. It's like water. We need Canadians to understand that this is of utmost priority to all of us. As I've answered this question before, first of all, the department does work very closely with communities to make sure that we understand their current needs and their ongoing needs and their infrastructure.
Minister, the Auditor General has said that the department has no plan to reach the 2030 goal that you've set.
I'm saying that the department works regularly and consistently with First Nations on the planning that they're undertaking to close those gaps, and we continue to have.
Do you accept the Auditor General's report?
We accept all recommendations. I will be clear. The Auditor General has made good recommendations, including really focusing the work to make sure that the most vulnerable communities get the care that they need, which is part 2 of your question. But I will also say that what I have certainly learned over the last 2.5 years, and I know that the department knows very well, is that we must do this with Indigenous partners. We cannot do it to communities.
Absolutely.
We must ensure that Indigenous communities have the authority and autonomy.
On that, Minister, the Auditor General's report has also stated that your department is not working closely with First Nations to address this housing gap. So again, we're hearing one thing here, but the Auditor General's report, which you have said that you accept.
I don't think she said that we weren't working closely with First Nations. I think what she said was that some First Nations who are particularly vulnerable are having a hard time accessing the housing that they need. And that is certainly something that keeps me up at night. I know the department is working very closely with those communities to determine how we can better accelerate building housing and other infrastructure in those very vulnerable communities.
Okay, thank you very much. And just with the limited time, I'd like to ask you about another Auditor General report around policing, Minister. So in 2022, the government had said that they were going to work around the clock to get some legislation on the table to support Indigenous policing services. Of course, it's 2 years later. There are 3 policing services in Northern Ontario that will soon be without an agreement moving forward. Unfortunately, this is putting the lives of First Nations people at risk, as you know, in our region, Minister. It's not just the policing itself, but sometimes ambulance services or other emergency services aren't able to do their jobs because of the lack of policing. So why is it that your government is dragging its feet on this very important issue?
Thank you very much. I will say that we do a complementary line of business, if you will, with Indigenous communities called Pathways to Safe Indigenous Communities, and it is a self-determined ability for First Nations to increase programs, interventions, and services for community safety and well-being. But you will have to ask my colleague, Minister LeBlanc, questions about the work that he's doing on developing Indigenous policing legislation, and that is work that I know is very important and dear to this government's heart.
Again, Minister, you say it's very important, but 2 years ago it was promised that it would be right around the corner and that the government would be working around the clock to get it done. That doesn't seem to add up to what we're hearing from you here today with respect.
Well, I will say this. Oftentimes, the government has a timeline that is ambitious, but we also work in a respectful way in full consultation with partners, and I look forward to the results of Minister LeBlanc's consultations with Indigenous partners, because that will help us ensure that the legislation that is resulting
thank you, Minister.
truly meets the needs of First Nations
I'd like to get
people.
one more question pertaining to the Federal Economic Development Agency in Northern Ontario, which, of course, you're the minister responsible for. Now, the service standards for providing response to applications have not been met for the Northern Ontario Development Program and the Regional Economic Growth through Innovation Program, according to the most recent information. You've said that addressing this issue is an important issue for you.